Hundeyin podcast would like to appreciate everyone who has listened and watched our episode. On behalf of the podcast, we would like to encourage every one of you to follow and subscribe to us using whichever medium you choose to listen to us. This increases our outreach and makes us bring bigger and better guests for amazing stories. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Hundeyin podcast. Today, I'm joined by Mr. David Hundeyin, who is an African investigative journalist, a writer, filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly. Mr. David, you're welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Obviously, I know there are quite few who don't know you, but for someone who may not know you, how would you introduce yourself, just briefly?
Okay, so I'm a journalist from Nigeria, and I'm the type of journalist that made it my career focus to go after the stories that nobody else wants to touch. So I'm basically what you would call a troublemaker. I'm a professional troublemaker. Troublemaker to the extent that I'm actually criminally wanted in Nigeria. I actually live in exile. I'm under accusation of treason in Nigeria because I'm the guy who goes to extents that other people are not prepared to go in search of what I think is right and what I think is the truth. So that's a very boiled down version of it. There's another version of this bio where I can tell you I've won this and that award, and yeah, but that's very boring. You can Google that stuff and find it. But I'm primarily a journalist. I'm also a documentary maker, and I'm an author. I'm a published author. I published 2 books, both of which I'm proud to say made it into the top 20 bestsellers in 2023 and 2024.
Okay. So, you investigative journalist, you bring truth to power. Why did you choose this avenue of journalism? Why did you go for those stories no one talks to?
So there's quite a bit of context to that, but so there was the immediate cause, but there's the more sort of long-term thing. So let me start with the long-term stuff. So I guess you would draw this all the way back to university. So I went to the University of Hull in the UK. That was where I did my first degree. I studied creative writing and media, culture and society. And I finished in 2011. And during the course of the program, there was a lot of non-academic education that happened to me within those 3 years. But I think the most impactful thing that happened to me during that 3 years was when I got into a relationship with a lady from Zimbabwe, from a town called Kwekwe in Zimbabwe. And that was like my first time being sort of culturally immersed in another African culture from outside of West Africa. Because the thing with Nigerians is that because Nigeria is so big, there's so many people, and there's so many cultures within Nigeria, it's very easy to think that the world begins and ends there. Which is why if you've had an experience with Nigerians, many people think Nigerians are overbearing and very proud. That's where it comes from. It's because there's so much internal diversity that you barely even realize that there is like 54 other countries on the African continent and there's hundreds of other cultures. You don't encounter them very often. So that was like my first time encountering another Africa, and I was completely captivated by it. So even after the relationship ended, the sort of cultural awakening that it had provoked in me never went away. One of the important things it did for me was that for the first time, I became aware that the experience that you know as racism, which obviously we all faced in the UK at the time, wasn't restricted to like Europe or North America or whatnot. That there were people in Africa who had gone through and still go through similar experiences at the hands of white settler populations or whatnot. I didn't know. I knew about apartheid in a very sort of distant academic sense, But this was my first time, like, sort of being up close with a Southern African who lived through a similar kind of experience to that, and it made me very curious about, learning about Africa and learning about, what is actually going on my continent outside of Nigeria and West Africa that I'm familiar with. And that led me down this rabbit hole, which I would say this started maybe 2010. And it led me down this rabbit hole where over the years, I came to understand that the Africa that I thought existed when I was growing up all those years in Lagos in Nigeria, and the Africa that actually exists are two completely different. It was an Africa where the primary thing that was wrong was like the leadership and the people, and everything boiled down to that. But as I became more aware, I realized that there are external entities that are extensively engaged and involved in everything that happens in Africa. I didn't know this previously. So I'll say that's where my interest in information and how the world works and power, that's where it sparked up. That's where it came from. Now, the more immediate thing that led me into this brand of journalism, I would say it was in 2017. My dad died, and he died in a very the way he died was just there's no way to describe it. It was as if a roach. Sorry, I can't seem to see a situation that was very emotionally difficult for me because nobody was expecting it, and he was fine. There was no real problem. I mean, he was hypertensive and diabetic, but these were very well managed, and he had had these for a long time. And all of a sudden, one day, he just had a partial stroke, a survivable partial stroke, and the ambulance just didn't show up, and that's the end of the story. Like that's it. That's the story. And he just died very, very randomly and very unexpectedly and very avoidably. And apart from the fact of dealing with my dad's death, it was this senselessness of it that just I couldn't accept it. That why would a human being die because an ambulance just didn't show up? There's no reason for it to not show up because there are ambulances, the infrastructure exists, everything is in place. It just didn't show up for no reason in particular. And apparently nobody could be held accountable for it. Nobody could be held responsible. And when I tried to pursue the matter, I was essentially told to, if I didn't like the fact that, this happened to me, then I should go to court. In Nigeria, when someone tells you to go to court, it's a diplomatic way of telling you to F off. Right?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because if you go to court in Nigeria, you could spend 15 years in court. Court is something you actively avoid in Nigeria, right? And I just couldn't accept it. That is this the worth of a human life in this part of the world? Why should this be happening? I just could not accept it. And so at that time, I was working in television, Nigeria's largest TV station. It's called Channels TV. I was a writer on a show called The Other News. It's a political satire show. So if you're familiar with The Daily Show, which used to be hosted by Trevor Noah. So The Other News was like a Nigerian daily show, pretty much. So I decided that I wanted to be able to sort of fight back, if that makes sense, make some kind of an impact in the world around, because here I am, I'm writing stuff that appears on TV. I'm writing for international platforms. I was doing stuff for like Yahoo Finance and The Motley Fool, CCN.com. My stuff was appearing in sort of mid-tier international media, but nobody knew who I was in Nigeria. And my stuff generally wasn't directed at Nigerian audiences or African audiences. With the exception of my work on The Other News, nothing else I did was directed at an African audience. And the day when I really had my come to Jesus moment was the day when I think I just written an analysis piece about Trump, because he was president then. This was sometime in 2018, and I was in a Slack channel like with my colleague, because it was like a global workplace, and I got racially abused in the Slack channel by one of the colleagues who was unhappy that I criticized Donald Trump, and she basically said something to the effect of, "Why don't you go write about rapes in Soweto?" Sort of very rude way of telling you to go back to Africa and mind your African business. Stop writing about my country. You're just a bloody black African, so mind your black African business. And I mean, I was offended by it, but at the same time, I also sat down and thought about it. Like, look, because I was living in Lagos at the time. Oh, he's gone again. Yeah, so at the time I was living in Lagos, and I sat down and thought to myself that actually, why am I dedicating so much energy and so much attention to what is happening in the U.S. or whatever? Like, internal American politics, the disputes between the people with blue hair and nose rings and the people with sunshades and MAGA hats. Like, why is that my problem? I'm living in the largest African city in the world. I'm living in the largest black city in the world. And there's a lot of stuff happening around me that I wish I could have an impact on. I mean, look at how my dad died. And I'm not doing anything. Instead, I'm writing about Trump. What the hell am I doing with my life? So that was when I made the decision finally in 2018 that I'm going to stop writing for international platforms and I'm going to start focusing my attention on Nigeria and Africa. So in 2019, I finally executed that pivot. I mean, I planned to do it sometime in 2019, but it didn't happen the way I planned it. It happened before I intended to start. I wrote an article about the Nigerian election in 2019 for an American audience, but the article went viral in Nigeria because the internet is a wonderful place like that. And for the first time, people in Nigeria started to know who I was. At the time, nobody knew who I was in Nigeria, right? Which was funny because I had actually been nominated by the US State Department for an IVLP at that point because of my work on that TV show, which at the time I thought was validation for my good work. Now I know better, but at the time I thought of that as validation. And I was wondering, I'm so good at what I do. Why doesn't anybody know who I am? And then in 2019, when that happened, then everybody started to know who I was. And then I started doing sort of Nigeria-focused work. I started writing for Business Day, which is like a daily newspaper in Nigeria. Then I started writing for Vanguard, which is another daily newspaper in Nigeria. Then I started working with a website called newswirenGR.com. That was where I got my big break as an investigative reporter. That was where I did my first investigative, pieces that sort of established me in that space. And then I did that between 2019 and 2020. Now, 2020 was when this all happened really fast. 2020, the NSAS protest happened, then the Lekki massacre, which ended it. And as a direct result of that, I ended up having to go into exile. And I didn't realize it was going to be permanent, but I knew I had to leave the country at that point, which I did. And then shortly after I left, I set up West Africa Weekly, which was then a Substack newsletter at the time. So the story behind that was I was accepted onto a program called Substack Local. Substack was looking for 12 writers and journalists from around the world. They put together a $1 million pot, and they said they're looking for 12 people from around the world who they're going to fund them for 1 year to grow their publication, and it's going to be focused around local news. So I was the only one from Africa who ended up being selected, and I also got paid by far the least, but that's another story of all the 12. Because of, again, location-based pay. So anyway, that gave me a runway for 1 year. Then I set up West Africa Weekly, and West Africa Weekly, I think, is where this story really, really, really sort of grew its wings. That's when, it's as a direct result of stuff I did on West Africa Weekly that I became an enemy of state and all the stuff that has happened since then. But yeah, that's a very sort of drilled down version of the past decade and a half or so.
So the next question I was going to ask you is that what would you say is your most acclaimed critical investigative piece? That you sit back and be like, I'm glad I shed light on this issue.
That's a very difficult question to answer because, again, every single one of the major stories I've done has been specifically aimed at being a story that has that kind of an impact. Okay, so there are different ways of answering that question. You can answer it in terms of which one has received the most awards, if that's your way of measuring acclaim. So there's an answer for that. But there's another answer, which is which one did I get the most personal satisfaction from? Or which one do I think is the most societally valuable? So the answer to the first one is, in terms of awards and everything, that would be a story that I did on a phantom airline called Nigeria Air. Well, okay, let me be more specific because it was basically a four-in-one story that I bundled into one. So there were four stories actually. It was a story about a phantom airline called Nigeria Air, which you might have heard of. Story about when shortly before the last Nigerian president left, where Boeing 737 was rented from Ethiopian Airlines, was wrapped in the livery of a non-existent airline called Nigeria Air, and it was paraded in front of the cameras in Abuja as Nigeria Air, when no such thing actually existed. So that was one of the stories. Another one of the stories was about something called Antigua Airways, which was like this really terrible story of like a Nigerian guy who set up this fictitious airline and finessed a bunch of Cameroonian people out of their money, promising to get them to Antigua, which supposedly was within spitting distance of the US, because they were trying to immigrate to the US, and they ended up becoming refugees. Some of them ended up dying there. It was a really bad story. The third story was about corruption within the Nigerian Civil Aviation Authority, which was also like a really messy story. And then the fourth story was about a Nigerian airline founder who basically had his airline stolen from him by his partner. And the airline is currently operated. It's called Green Africa Airways. So it was basically, I grouped those four stories into one. And the story was called Nigerian Aviation Special. What the hell is happening in Nigerian civil aviation? So I won multiple awards for that. So I remember winning the PwC Media Excellence Award in 2023 for the Special Investigative Reporting category. So I won first place in that. And then the same year, I was a finalist at the AIJC African Investigative Journalist of the Year. So I was actually invited to the ceremony in Johannesburg. I wasn't able to go, unfortunately. I was shortlisted rather for the Sigma Award for Data Journalism in the same year for that story. I was what was it called? I was named most outstanding young person in journalism at the Lagos Youth Awards, also in that year. And there was one more thing. Yes, I was listed among the 100 most influential Africans of 2023 by the New African magazine. So that was that. Now, in answer to the question, which story did I feel had the most public utility? That would be the story that I did about the current Nigerian president. From Bola Ahmed Tinubu, from drug lord to presidential candidate. The reason I think that story had the most social utility was, in addition to merely informing Nigerians about the background of this person that was running to be their president and who ended up becoming their president one way or the other. In addition to doing that, what it also did was that I think it served as a good narrative entry point for a lot of Nigerians and even non-Nigerians, Africans, to start to understand what neocolonialism actually is in a practical sense and how it actually works. Because I think the failure of what you would refer to as the classic Pan-Africanists, the failure of their message to resonate with the younger generation has primarily been an issue of communication, right? So if you're listening to, and I say this with all respect, I'm not disrespecting anybody. PLO Lumumba is a personal hero of mine, right? But if you're listening to like the PLO Lumumba talk about these issues, you can sleep off because it sounds distant. It doesn't sound relatable. It sounds very academic and ivory tower. Most people just can't connect with it. So if he's talking about what was contemporary to him, so he's talking about like Julius Nyerere. So as I was saying, so if he's talking about like a Julius Nyerere type or something, to an African under 30, that means nothing to them, because if someone who probably died before you were born, what the hell does that have to do with me, right? So the existence of concepts like neocolonialism or global imperialism, that these concepts have never been properly explained, I think, to most young Africans. So most young Africans think of them almost like either an academic thing that you learn in political science in university or as a conspiracy theory. That just,
Mm.
it doesn't mean anything to you. But what the story did was that it demonstrated very practically that this is what it means for a puppet president to exist in your country. Like this entity, this foreign government goes and looks for the worst of you, like a criminal from the streets, right? This person should be in jail. And instead of jailing this person under their jurisdiction as they should, they instead cultivate this person as an asset,
Yeah.
turn this person into somebody who works for them, and then dispatch this person back to their country of origin to become a tool operating on their behalf. And then this person is sort of helped along the way, becomes a governor, and then becomes the national leader of what is then the main opposition party, and then later on becomes the president. And then when he becomes the president, you can then clearly see how every single major policy decision that he takes didn't come out of his own head or didn't come out of his administration. It came directly from Washington D.C. and you can see the impact that each of these decisions have had. So in Nigeria, for example, for many decades, it's been a thing of it's been an issue of great national debate whether the recommendations from the World Bank and IMF should be fully implemented. Right, as far back as I can remember, it's always been an issue of national controversy. This guy came in, and for the first time in Nigeria's history, president came in, and there wasn't even a conversation about it. There was no debate, there was no arguments, there was nothing. He
Oh.
implemented everything without exception, every single thing. And the result is that Nigeria, which as of 2015 was Africa's number one economy, is now Africa's number four economy.
Yeah,
The economy
yeah, I
has
saw that.
almost it's lost about 66% in the space of 10 years. So as of 2015, it was about 510 billion. As at the latest figures, it's about 185 billion, which is disastrous, right? And this happens because of puppet leadership. I feel like before this story came out, many Nigerian audiences would have treated this like it was, it's just an academic point. Like what is a puppet leader? What is neocolonialism? What do these words have to do with me? How do they describe my situation? All I can see is that my road is bad. My lights always go off. There's no the hospitals are not well equipped. The schools are not good. That means that the problem is that I have a bad leader. I have a bad president. And that's where
Yeah, yeah,
that's
yeah.
the extent. That's the full extent of the problem. And once I can have a good patriotic president, then everything will be fine. Because my problems begin and end with the people who are stealing money, right? That's the
Yeah.
very popular idea. But I think with this
Mm.
story, people then started to understand that there is a much deeper level to all of this,
Yeah.
starting from how the hell do these people who steal money, how do they always seem to get into power and stay there? So I feel like this story provided a very good entry point and it has elevated the level of public discourse in Nigeria now. So that's why I
Mm.
said there are two answers to the question.
Nice. And I know it's risky when I look at journalists like you, I look at Anas, like it's risky to bring truth to power. But do you think eventually the topics you shed light on will eventually come to fruition? Like you see a new Africa because of your works. Do you think it's possible?
I don't know about because of my work. I don't think I'm that important as a single person. But I think I'm definitely part of a wider emerging narrative. So as at maybe 2011, when the NATO invasion into Libya was going on, um, even though at the time, part of me was, I was still maybe quite a bit naive. So I was still maybe a bit happy that, a dictator is being toppled, and it's part of this thing called the Arab Spring.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
Hosni Mubarak has gone, Ben Ali, the guy in Tunisia, has gone. So Muammar Gaddafi is also going. Like there's a revolution going on. The youth of North Africa. I didn't have a full understanding of how the world worked then.
yeah.
But even then, even amidst all that, I remember I was still upset at the fact that Libyan infrastructure was being bombed. Right? Like in this supposedly in the process of protecting Libyan protesters. There were 7,000 bombing missions in Libya in just 8 months. 7,000 bombing missions. Right? If you're trying to neutralize military targets, you can do that with 700 bombing missions, 7,000 military missions. So clearly, the point of this wasn't just to try and neutralize the Libyan military; it was to destroy Libya itself, the country. Because what were they bombing? They were bombing bridges, they were bombing roads, they were bombing railway lines, they were bombing pipes. You know, the so-called Great Man-Made River Project that was bombed into non-existence, right? So they were actually destroying the country. And I remember at the time, even though I was, naively happy that the supposed dictator was being toppled, I was kind of unhappy at the fact that the way the news was being reported by, the usual suspects, the CNNs and the likes, didn't capture the full story that, there's a whole country with very well developed infrastructure which is being destroyed now. Somebody needs to take responsibility for that. That wasn't being captured at all. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, I was 21 years old at the time, that how I wish there were African media platforms that could tell these stories, because such things simply didn't exist at the time. Now, 14 or 15 years later, I think it's fair to say there are multiple African platforms that can now tell such stories, and to a global audience as well. So, and I like to think of myself as part of that emerging trend where it's no longer possible to control Africa's narrative from outside of Africa completely. It used to be entirely possible. And once CNN reports something, CNN in Atlanta will report something and it becomes true for the whole of Africa, whether it's true or not. So CNN in Atlanta would report that there's a white farmers in Zimbabwe are being massacred, right? Which never happened. But it will be reported and you believe it, right? As a kid, I used to grow up reading this magazine called BBC Focus on Africa. Right?
Me too.
Remember that magazine? And they would report these things. Oh my God, Robert Mugabe is mobilizing, black miscreants to go and attack white farmers, and as a child, again, I didn't fully understand how the world worked. I'll be feeling sympathy for these supposed white farmers and who are supposedly being victims of this horrible dictator called Robert Mugabe, right? So it used to be possible for someone in the US or in the UK to control Africa's narrative externally. That's no longer possible. And I think that's because people like me now exist. And there's a concentration of us. It's not just a few. There are quite a number of us. Even platforms like this, like a podcast like this didn't exist a decade ago. Right? So even this is part of that emerging movement where Africans are telling their own stories now and are controlling their own narrative now. And a good contemporary example of this is what is happening surrounding Ibrahim Traore, the president of Burkina Faso. If this were 13, 14 years ago, this guy would have already had the ultimate target painted on his back.
Yes, true.
He's a dictator. He's a totalitarian, authoritarian. All the terms and terminology. He runs a brutal military junta, authoritarian regime, imprisons journalists, goes after dissidents and political opponents, restricts the civic space. All those cliches, right? So your mind would have been fully programmed that Ibrahim Traore has horns growing out of his head. The way our minds were programmed to think about Muammar Gaddafi and Robert Mugabe, all of these people who may or may not have had dictatorial tendencies, but were actually doing things primarily that were anti-imperial. And we didn't understand that. But the people controlling the narrative at the time understood that very well and were able to thoroughly control us, in ways that actually leave me feeling embarrassed when I think about it now. Yeah. But now that's no longer possible. Now voices like this exist. So that's where I think I come into it. So I think to an extent, it's not even an issue of us waiting to someday live through or someday experience a liberated Africa. I think we're actually living through that revolution right now.
There is this quote that you put it on Twitter. where literally you're saying that Africans shouldn't rely so much on the African Union, for it only relies on those that give it a lot of funding. It was in that narrative, and I really liked that tweet so much. But for someone who's, let's say, doesn't understand neo-colonialism and the money pool, don't you think such a statement would really hurt their feelings? Because we have these so-called Pan-Africanist organizations, ECOWAS, African Union, SADC, East African Community, and all that stuff. But you highlighted the fact that to their backers, not to member states. How would you expand on that?
Again, something that I think people are starting to understand now, but maybe didn't understand in much detail a few years ago, is that something can exist for a specific purpose, and then an external entity comes and uses funding to co-opt it, right? Uses their influence to co-opt it. So an example of this is, let me say, ECOWAS, for example. ECOWAS was formed to be primarily an economic and political union of West African states. The purpose of ECOWAS was to turn West Africa into a free trade zone, a customs union, a monetary union, and ultimately a sort of loose confederation, right? That was the purpose of ECOWAS. Now, so that's on the one hand. Now, when you then have an entity like France, which, as you may or may not know, there are two major power blocks within ECOWAS. So there's Nigeria, which funds a lot of what ECOWAS does, and then there's France, and then the EU behind France, which basically funds the other half of what ECOWAS does, right? So when you have that foreign entity coming in with its own agenda, which is incongruous with yours, let's just be clear about this. The agenda of France and the agenda of West Africa can never be on the same page, because France has a parasitic agenda. The goal of France and West Africa is to eat, is to extract, right? The goal of West Africa is to thrive, it's to develop. So those two things cannot happen at the same time. Only one of those things is possible at any given time. So when you have that external entity that has that extractive agenda coming in with funding, what inevitably happens is that the funder is able to provide direction as to how they want their funds to be spent. Right? And this is not some like people gather in a dark room and there's some skull and dagger conversation going on. No, this is in the open. It's on paper, it's in black and white. You can Google these things where they're guiding documents where these organizations like ECOWAS have to show so and so tranche of funding is being provided. Before the next tranche can be released, you have to show so and so and so outcomes. And the person that is writing these KPIs, these outcomes, is the person that is funding. So what you end up having is this organization, which was created for one reason, that is now doing something completely different because it has been entirely co-opted. It's not what it's doing has nothing to do with its supposed core remit. And the AU is another such example. So there was a time when there was a lot of noise being made about the so-called AU passport. That by January 1, 2014, the AU passport is going to be launched. I remember the Nigerian billionaire Aliko Dangote was being touted as one of the first people who's going to get an AU passport, a passport that gives you free access to 54 member states of the AU. And I remember I was so excited back in the day at the idea that I'm going to get this passport and wow, I'm going to have access to Africa in a way I've never had it before. I mean, I consider myself to be a well-traveled person. And so far, I've only been to about 15 African countries out of 55, right? So, I was so excited at the time. And then January came and passed. 2014 came and passed. 2015, 2019, 2025 now, there's no sign of any AU passport. And the simple reason behind that is the funding mechanism that would make the AU passport possible. That funding mechanism does not exist, right? The parts of the AU agenda that are favorable to whatever the EU wants it to do are the parts that get funded by the EU. So the AU passport and the AFCFTA and the rest of the so-called Agenda 2063, which is very Pan-African in outlook and which generally are the things that we want to see, those things are not funded. So those parts of the AU's agenda are basically the orphans, which are just left in limbo, like the way the AU passport has been in limbo since 2014. It exists on paper. In fact, as I'm made to understand, there were a few specimens that were actually produced. As I'm made to understand, there were. I'm not going to mention names, but I actually know a couple of people who actually did get these supposed AU passports. I mean, they're members of the AU Parliament, so I don't want to embarrass them by mentioning their names, but outside of AU parliamentarians, nobody else got it. So even Aliko Dangote, whom I referenced earlier, he doesn't have an AU passport. Aliko Dangote has to get visas when he's traveling around Africa. Africa's richest man needs visas to travel across Africa till now. And that's because the mechanism that is supposed to push that agenda at the AU isn't funded. Right? Every agenda at supranational level has to have a mechanism behind it, and every mechanism has to be funded, needs a budget. So the budgets for the mechanisms that are Pan-African in outlook, those budgets never get funded. And that's what happens. That's why we have a situation where you have these supposed Pan-African institutions that are acting as if they are extensions of the US and Europe, because that's pretty much what they are, in essence. And that's why you have countries like Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali choosing to leave these institutions altogether, like ECOWAS, and saying that ECOWAS doesn't represent the founding ideals on which it was founded anymore, so they no longer have any use for it. That's the reason.
Wow, I like that insight. One of my final questions would be, for someone doing journalism right now and wants to bring truth to power, what advice would you give?
So the first thing I'll say is don't. But if you insist on doing it, potentially at risk of all the things that I have been at risk of, then what I will say is that if you're going to do it, then do it to the end. Do it well, right? So what I often see is that people come into this space filled with this sort of zeal and enthusiasm, and they want to make a difference, and they're going to tell truth to power, they're going to tell it as it is, and yada yada yada. And within 18 months to 2 years, they're just completely burnt out, because they just realize that there's so much that is going on that is just so far beyond me. There's the actors are so incomprehensibly big, and no matter what scandal I think I'm exposing, no matter what accountability I think I'm bringing here, nothing ever happens, nothing ever changes, no one is ever held responsible for anything. So why am I even doing this? And then it's not even financially rewarding. So what I would say to people is, before coming into this space, and this is what has worked for me, first have an ideological investment in what it is that you want to do. And what I mean by that is telling truth to power and holding power accountable is not an ideology. It's just a thing people do. It's not an ideology. You need an actual ideology. That could be an economic ideology. That could be a social political ideology. I don't know what it is. I'm not going to recommend anything. People are free to believe whatever they want to believe. But you need to you need to actually believe in a wider purpose for what it is that you are doing. So in my case, I've always had a Pan-Africanist outlook. As I explained, starting from going back as far as 2010, when I was first introduced to the rest of my continent and I fell in love with it, I've always understood that this is where my future lies, right? So even though it wasn't necessarily the most financially rewarding decision to make at the time, and even though it came with all these risks attached to it, I've been declared wanted for treason in Nigeria. If I set foot in Nigeria, I'm going to be... And to put this in perspective, treason in Nigeria is a capital offense. If you're found guilty of it, you'll be executed, or you'll be put on death row, right? So I've been accused of a capital offense back home. I'm not doing all of that because I want to hold power accountable. I want to tell truth. No, I have a much bigger reason in mind for doing that. It's because I want to see my people free. And I understand that the people who are my actual enemies, right? The people who are actually in charge are not the people I can see in Abuja and in Johannesburg and in Kampala and in Yaoundé. these capitals of Africa, that these people you are seeing here, these are all vassals. Right? They are basically satraps, right? If you know what a satrap is, it's basically like a little vassal king, that has some little jurisdiction over an area, but you are really answering to the power that is up there. So all of them that are there, they are chasing you around, they're throwing you in prison, arresting you and whatnot. These are not the people who are actually your enemies. And these are not the people who are actually in power, right? Yoweri Museveni is not in power. Paul Biya is not in power. Bola Tinubu is not in power. William Ruto is not in power. Those are just vassals. The real people who are in power are the people who put them there. Those people live in Brussels, they live in DC, they live in Paris, they live in London. That's where the real power is. It's not this little. So that's where the real fight is. That, and I understand that very clearly. That's why I have the motivation to do what I do, because I understand that even these guys, these bad guys that we love to hate, to an extent, and I'm not suggesting that they are victims or something, but I'm saying to an extent they themselves are also just, they are just a part of a system that somebody else built. So the job I'm trying to do is to be part of an alternative system that will displace this existing system. So I'm not just fighting a defensive war, which is what a lot of African journalists do, because defensive wars are always lost. I'm not just fighting a defensive war that, release this person from prison, stop infringing on our constitutional rights. We must have freedom of speech, blah, 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 blah. You'll get burnt out very easily if that's all, if that's what you think this is about. That's not what this is about. For me, this is about an ideological idea of what I consider to be political and economic freedom for Africans and how to accomplish that. So that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. So that's the advice that I can give. Have an ideological grounding in what it is that you think you are going to do. Don't jump in here thinking that youthful zeal for fighting injustice and it's not going to take you very far. You'll burn out very quickly.
Okay. My last question to you would be: what makes you a proud African?
That's a very broad question, but I'll attempt to answer it. So I think first of all, historically, we are the first people in the world, right? We are the first people on Earth. It's been scientifically proven that humanity, as we know, is basically came out of the Rift Valley in East Africa. That's the entire mass of humanity as we know it. So Africans are basically the world's first people. Everybody else is basically a mutation of the sub-Saharan African, right? We are the world's original. Obviously, we're the world's first people. Historically, we're behind some of the world's most impressive civilizations, and this is stretching from as far south as Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe, as far north as Kemet or Egypt. We were responsible for that. Some of the great civilizations of West Africa as well. So, and he's gone off again. The world's original people, and everything that has gone wrong for us over the past 500 to 600 years is not the end of our history, but it's just a chapter in our history. We existed long before any of this, and we will always exist in some form. We survived a lot of what we have survived over the past half a millennium, where actual genocidal efforts were made against us. There were multiple attempted genocides against different groups of Africans, with the ultimate goal being the same: to either eradicate Africans from the surface of this planet or from our continent where we belong, or to reduce the African to the level of being a beast of the field, right? To prevent light from reaching our minds, as one of them very famous.
Yeah.
So, despite all of that, people like us exist in 2025, right? We exist on the African continent, in the heart of sub-Saharan Africa, and we are making the moves that we are making. We are controlling the narratives that we're controlling. We're putting out the information that we're putting out. We are actually making these very, sort of, I don't want to use the term successful because that would be premature. But we're making these very powerful moves toward physical, intellectual, economic, and political sovereignty. despite everything that has gone wrong over the past half a millennium. So clearly, the fact that we still exist proves that everything that was ever said pejoratively about us is not true, right?
Mm.
We are every bit as spectacular as we think we are. And the proof of that is that we are doing the spectacular things, even though some people didn't think that it's supposed to be possible. We're still here, and we will always be here.
Mm.
So, I don't need any sort of uh, specific reason to be proud of the fact that I exist. The fact that I exist is enough reason in and of itself.
Okay. Okay.
Ooh, okay.
Thank you, Mr. David, for passing by. We truly, truly appreciate it.